There is a stump in Humboldt County, California, that is wider than most living rooms. It has been sitting in the same spot since 1890. The tree that produced it was alive when the Mongol Empire was expanding across Asia. It had been growing in that soil for over 1,000 years before anyone thought to cut it, and it was cut in a single afternoon. The stump is still there. It will be there long after everyone reading this is gone, and every summer tourists walk up to it and stand on it and take photographs and call it remarkable, which is the word people use when they mean something they cannot fully process. What they are standing on is the base of something that no longer exists. The top, the 1,000-year accumulation of wood and bark and branch and canopy, is gone. It became lumber. It became railroad ties. It became the floors of houses that are still standing in San Francisco. The stump is what the world could not use. What the world could use, it took. I want to start there because I think that stump is the right beginning for what I am going to tell you, not because it is the most dramatic example, because it is the most honest one. It is recent enough that we have photographs of the cutting. It is accessible enough that you can drive to it and put your hands on it. It is documented well enough that we know exactly what happened to the tree it came from and exactly when. There is no mystery about the stump in Humboldt County. That is precisely why it is the right place to start before we ask the harder questions about trees that disappeared so long ago. No photograph exists, no record survives, no tourist attraction marks their place. We need to look clearly at the one we can see. We need to understand what it means that something of that scale was here and is gone, and then we need to ask whether it has happened before, not once, not twice, repeatedly, at scales that make the Humboldt stump look modest. Let me tell you what the original redwood forests were, not the fragments that remain, the protected groves and the second-growth forests that have grown up in the last 100 years. The original forests, the forests that existed before the logging industry arrived in the 1850s and began the systematic removal of what had taken thousands of years to build. There were approximately 2 million acres of coast redwood forest along the California coast when the first European settlers arrived. 2 million acres of trees that in many cases had been growing for between 500 and 2,000 years. The tallest of them, based on the stumps that remain and the early survey records that describe trees before they were cut, reached heights that the current record holders only approach. The current tallest living tree, Hyperion, stands at 380 feet. The early survey accounts describe trees that were estimated at over 400 feet. The stumps of cut trees, measured in the field by survey teams, sometimes exceed diameters that the largest living trees do not reach. The trees that were cut were, in many cases, larger than the trees that survive today, and they were cut because they were larger. Larger meant more lumber. Larger trees were targeted first. The selection pressure of commercial logging ran directly against size. The biggest went first. What remained was the smaller. What we measure today as the upper limit of what a coast redwood can be is the upper limit of what was left. After 60 years of selecting against the largest individuals, the ceiling we measure is the ceiling of the survivors, not the ceiling of the original population. Here is the number I want you to hold, 96%. That is the proportion of the original old-growth coast redwood forest that no longer exists. 96% of 2 million acres is gone. Not thinned, not managed, not reduced. Gone. The trees that stood there are lumber now, or ash from slash fires, or simply decayed into the soil. What remains, the protected groves, the fragments in state and national parks, represents approximately 4% of what was there. If you have ever stood in a coast redwood grove and felt the scale of it, the way the canopy closes above you, and the light filters green through 150 feet of living wood, and felt something that you could not quite name, but that had to do with smallness and time and the sense of being inside something ancient, that feeling was produced by 4%. 4% of the original generated that feeling. I keep asking myself what 100% felt like. I keep asking what it felt like to stand in a forest that extended for 2 million acres of that unbroken, coast after coast, ridge after ridge, canyon after canyon, the full depth and height and complexity of an ecosystem that had been building itself for millennia without interruption. I cannot imagine it. I do not think the human nervous system currently has a reference point for it. The reference point was removed before anyone thought to preserve the experience of it. Now I want to take you further back, because the coast redwoods, as extraordinary as they are and as extraordinary as their loss is, are not the oldest example of what I am describing. They are the most recent and the most documented. The pattern goes back much further, and the further back it goes, the larger the scale becomes, and the more completely the evidence of what was lost has been buried under the subsequent history of the planet. I want to take you to the Carboniferous period. Not because I am going to tell you that the trees of the Carboniferous were literally 40 miles tall. That is not a claim I am making. I am going to take you there because the Carboniferous is where the evidence for a different kind of forest, a forest of a scale and biological productivity that the current world does not contain, is preserved in the rock under our feet. The coal we have been burning since the Industrial Revolution is the compressed remains of Carboniferous forests. That coal exists. You can hold it in your hand. It came from somewhere. And where it came from was a forest. A forest so large and so productive and so biologically extraordinary that its compressed remains have been powering human civilization for 200 years and the deposits are still not exhausted. The Carboniferous period lasted approximately 60 million years, from roughly 359 to 299 million years ago. For most of that period, the atmospheric oxygen concentration was significantly higher than it is today. The current atmosphere is approximately 21% oxygen. During the Carboniferous, it reached approximately 35%. That difference is not a technical footnote. It is the central fact of the Carboniferous world. A 35% oxygen atmosphere is a fundamentally different environment from the one we live in. Things that cannot exist in our atmosphere could exist in that one. Things that are merely large in our atmosphere could be enormous. In that one, the metabolic possibilities expand, the physical limits on biological scale shift. And the biological world of the Carboniferous reflects those shifted limits. Dragonflies with wingspans of 2 feet, millipedes the length of a car, scorpions the size of dogs. These are not speculative. These are fossils. We have them. We know these animals existed because their remains are preserved in the same rock sequences that contain the coal. They lived in the same forests that produced the coal, and the forests that supported an atmosphere capable of producing those animals. The forests that produced 35% oxygen continuously for 60 million years were not modest. The oxygen itself is the record of the forests. Every molecule of oxygen above the baseline of what geological processes alone would produce came from a plant. 60 million years of 35% oxygen is 60 million years of photosynthetic output at a scale that the current world's vegetation cannot match. I want to be careful here because this is where the question becomes genuinely open rather than settled. The standard scientific explanation for the Carboniferous oxygen spike is that the atmosphere filled with oxygen. Because the organisms that would normally decompose dead plant material, the fungi and bacteria that break down wood and return carbon to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, had not yet evolved the biochemical tools to break down lignin, the tough structural polymer that gives wood its strength. Wood, the explanation goes, accumulated. Faster than it decayed, the carbon was buried, the oxygen was released. The coal is the buried carbon. That explanation is real and it has genuine support in the scientific literature, but it does not fully account for the scale. Even if decomposition was slower than today, the rate of photosynthetic production required to maintain 35% oxygen for 60 million years requires a biological productivity that has never been adequately quantified. The models that try to account for it require assumptions about the density and height of Carboniferous forests that are, to use the technical term, generous. Generous in scientific modeling means the number works if you assume the most favorable values for all of the uncertain parameters, and when a model requires generosity across multiple uncertain parameters to produce the observed result. The honest response is to ask whether the model is right or whether one of the assumed values is significantly wrong. In this case, the assumed value that is hardest to verify and most consequential for the result is the height of the trees, and the height of the trees is the one thing that the fossil record, in most cases, does not preserve. We find stumps, we find root systems, we find trunk sections, scattered and fragmented, transported by ancient rivers and deposited in the floodplain sediments that became the coal measure rocks. We find leaves and spores and the small biological debris of a forest ecosystem. We do not find the tops of the trees. We do not find the full height preserved anywhere in the record. The tallest confirmed Carboniferous tree, based on a standing fossil found in Nova Scotia, with its roots still in the original soil, reached a preserved height of approximately 12 meters before the upper section was missing. 12 meters, and the trunk at the point of breakage was still substantial. The tree was not finished. It had simply broken at that height and the upper section was gone, carried away by the flood. That buried the lower section. The actual height, the height of the complete living tree, is unknown. Every estimate of Carboniferous tree height is an estimate of the lower bound based on incomplete evidence. The upper bound is genuinely open. It is constrained by physical and hydraulic arguments about what is possible in the current atmosphere. But the Carboniferous atmosphere was not the current atmosphere, and the physical and hydraulic limits of tree height in a 35% oxygen atmosphere are not the same as the limits in a 21% oxygen atmosphere. The ceiling was higher. How much higher is a question I do not think has been answered. Here is something I want you to think about. The forests of the Carboniferous did not end gradually. They ended in an event called the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. Approximately 307 million years ago, the climate shifted. The vast tropical forests that had covered the equatorial regions of Pangaea fragmented suddenly. Patches survived. The rest died. What had been a continuous forest ecosystem covering much of the land surface of the planet was broken into isolated fragments, and the fragments then contracted and died as the climate continued to change. The coal seams that we mine today are the record of that death. The forests fell and fell and fell and were buried and were compressed and became the black rock that we have been digging up and burning. The forests are gone. The coal is what remains. And every time we burn coal, we are combusting the compressed remains of a forest that was alive 60 million years before the first dinosaur walked the earth. That is not a metaphor. That is literally what is happening in a coal-fired power plant, the carbon that was fixed by photosynthesis. In the Carboniferous forests, the carbon that was buried when those forests died and became coal is being returned to the atmosphere now, 300 million years later. The trees are gone, their carbon is back, and the world they once produced, the world they built with their bodies and maintained with their photosynthesis, is gone too. We are living in what came after. We do not have a clear picture of what we came after. I want to come back to the present. To the trees we can still see and touch and measure, because I think the present gives us the best tools for imagining the past. Let me tell you about the Amazon. The Amazon rainforest is the largest tropical forest on Earth, covering approximately 5.5 million square kilometers. It contains an estimated 390 billion individual trees. It produces approximately 20% of the world's oxygen. It stores an estimated 150 billion metric tons of carbon. In its biomass, roughly the equivalent of 15 years of total global human carbon emissions at current rates. These are large numbers. They are the kind of numbers that are easy to absorb as statistics and hard to feel as reality. But they are what a large intact forest looks like in measurable terms. Now consider that the Amazon, for all its scale, is a depleted system. The megafauna that once inhabited it, the large mammals that dispersed seeds and maintained the forest structure, were mostly extinct by 10,000 years ago. The human populations that managed the forest for thousands of years before European contact, and whose management practices shaped the structure and species composition of significant parts of what we now call pristine rainforest, were reduced by 90% within a century of European arrival by disease and violence. The forest we are measuring and studying and trying to protect is not the forest that existed 500 years ago, let alone 5,000 years ago. It is a changed forest, a simplified forest, a forest that has already lost much of its original biological complexity, and it is still the largest and most productive forest ecosystem on Earth. What was the Amazon before the losses? What was the world's forest before the Carboniferous collapse? What were the forests before whatever ended them in each of the geological periods that preceded the one we live in? Those questions do not have complete answers, but the direction the incomplete evidence points is consistently toward more height, more biomass, more biological complexity, more oxygen, more of everything that forests are and do. The giant sequoias are the last thing I want to discuss before I close, because I think they are the most direct window we have into the question of what trees can be when left alone long enough. The giant sequoias of the Sierra Nevada are not the tallest trees. The coast redwoods are taller. The giant sequoias are the largest trees by volume, and they are among the oldest. The General Sherman tree, which survives today because it was considered too difficult to extract profitably, contains approximately 52,000 cubic feet of wood. It is approximately 2,200 years old. Its trunk at the base is over 36 feet in diameter. It was a mature adult tree when the Roman Empire was at its height, and it is still growing, still adding mass every year, at a rate that increases rather than decreases with age, because the largest trees add the most wood per year in absolute terms. The Sherman tree today is adding more wood annually than a 50-year-old sequoia adds in a decade. It is not slowing down. It is not approaching the end of its productive life. It is in the accelerating phase of growth that very large, very old trees enter when they have enough canopy access to light and enough root access to water and nutrients to run their photosynthetic machinery at full capacity. If you left that tree alone for another 2,000 years, what would it be? If you left it alone for 10,000 years, for 50,000 years, for the duration of the Carboniferous, 60 million years of continuous growth without any of the interruptions that have ended every large tree's life so far in the history of this planet, what would it become? I do not know. I do not think anyone knows. The experiment has never been allowed to run that long. Every large tree that has ever existed has been ended before the experiment concluded. By fire, by disease, by a changed climate, by a logger with a saw. The full potential of what a tree can become has never been observed. What we see in the sequoias and the redwoods and the great trees of every era is a middle stage. A stage that is impressive enough to make us feel small. And the question I keep asking is what the later stages look like, what the completed experiment looks like, what a tree becomes when it is allowed to grow for longer than any tree has ever been allowed to grow. The stumps are everywhere. Every continent has them in one form or another, the bases of things that were ended before they finished. The experiment keeps being interrupted, and the record of what the experiment was building, the record of where it was going and how large it was becoming, that record is in the coal and the rock and the compressed carbon of every geological period that contained great forests and then ended them. The trees are gone. The question of what they were building remains, and I think it is one of the most interesting questions we have. There is one final thing I want to say, and it is the thing I think is most important and most often missed when people engage with the history of the great forests. The loss of the trees is not just a loss of biomass. It is not just a loss of carbon storage or oxygen production or the measurable ecological services that forests provide. It is a loss of time. Trees are time made visible. Every ring in a tree trunk is a year, and the rings of a very old tree are a record of everything that happened during its life, the wet years and the dry years, the cold years and the warm, the fires that scarred it and healed, the droughts that narrowed its rings and the good years that widened them. When a very old tree is cut, the record it contains is ended. The rings stop, the accumulation of biological time stops, and it cannot be restarted by planting a new tree, because a new tree begins its record at zero, and the thousands of years of record that the old tree contained are gone with it, the second growth forests that cover much of the land where old-growth forests once stood are not empty. They are forests. They contain trees and birds and fungi, and the beginning of the long process of ecological succession that might, given enough time and freedom from disturbance, eventually produce something approaching what was there before. But they are young. Their records are short. The biological time that accumulated in the original trees, the millennia of growth and adaptation and the ecological complexity that only millennia can produce is gone. We can plant. We cannot replace. The time is gone. And the question of what the world looked like when that time was still accumulating, when the great forests were still growing and the experiment was still running, is a question that the stumps cannot fully answer. They can only ask it. Which is what they have been doing, in their silence, for as long as they have been standing there, waiting for someone to understand what the question is. I want to go back to the stump in Humboldt County for a moment, because I left something unsaid about it, and I think that unsaid thing is the most important part when you stand on that stump and look at the rings in the cut surface. You are looking at a record. Each ring is a year. The inner rings, the ones near the center, are the oldest, the earliest years of the tree's life, when it was a sapling and then a young tree and then something that was beginning to be large. The outer rings, the ones near the edge, the ones nearest to where the saw passed, are the most recent years, the years just before 1890. The years when the tree was at its largest and its oldest and its most fully itself. And the gap between the innermost ring and the outermost ring is the life of the tree. 1,000 years, compressed into a cross-section that you can walk across in 30 seconds. 1,000 years of rings, each one a year, each one different from the ones before and after it, each one a record of what the world was like in that particular year, in that particular canyon, in that particular forest. The rings remember things that no human record preserves, droughts that happened before California was named, wet years that produced floods in rivers that had no names yet, fires that scarred the tree and then healed, volcanic eruptions on the other side of the world whose atmospheric effects showed up as narrow rings in a California forest. All of that is in the wood, or was in the wood, before 1890. What I keep asking when I stand at that stump is not just what was lost when that particular tree was cut. I keep asking about the cumulative record that was lost when 96% of the original forest was cut. 2 million acres of trees, most of them hundreds of years old, some of them over 1,000 years old, each one carrying in its rings a record of the conditions of the time it lived through. That record is gone. Not most of it, essentially all of it. The protected groves that remain, the 4%, preserve some record, but the vast majority of the environmental record that the original forest carried in its wood was converted to lumber and ash in 60 years. And the window it represented, the window into the specific conditions of the California coast over the past 2,000 years, the atmospheric record, the climate record, the ecological record that only old trees in an intact ecosystem can provide, that window is closed. We are working with 4% of the data we would have had, and the 4% is biased toward trees too small or inaccessible to be worth cutting. The data we lost was from the largest, oldest, most informative trees. The selection pressure that took the trees took the record too. Now extend that logic to every great forest that has ever been lost. Every forest cleared for agriculture in the 10,000 years since farming began. Every forest burned or cut by civilizations needing fuel, farmland, or building material. Every forest ended by climate events, ice ages, warm periods, sea level changes, volcanic episodes. Each of those losses was also a loss of record. Trees carried in their wood an irreplaceable record of their time and place. When they died, the record died with them. We have ice cores, ocean sediment cores, pollen records, and other proxies for past climate. These are valuable and real, but not the same as the tree ring record. The tree ring record is high resolution, year by year, each ring a data point, across millions of trees, centuries of growth. It's a database of extraordinary precision. Most of that database, for most of Earth's history, was destroyed. The forests are gone. The records they carried are gone. We are trying to understand the past with a fraction of the evidence. I want to illustrate the magnitude of what has been lost. The bristlecone pines. You may have heard of them. They grow in the high mountains of the American Southwest. They are the oldest living trees on Earth. Methuselah, approximately 4,850 years old, its location secret to protect it. It was a mature tree when the pyramids at Giza were being built. Another bristlecone, Prometheus, was cut in 1964 by a researcher. He didn't realize how old it was. It was approximately 4,900 years old. It was the oldest confirmed living organism on Earth at the time. It was cut to count its rings. The irony is not subtle. The oldest tree on Earth was killed to determine its age. Knowledge could have been learned from a small coarse ample without killing. The tree. The tree is gone. The knowledge it still had to give is gone too. The possibility of understanding a 5,000-year-old tree at 6,000 or 7,000 years, all of that is gone. What the bristlecone pines that remain give us is extraordinary, and also something heartbreaking in its limitation. The tree ring chronology, built from living and dead bristlecone pine wood, extends back approximately 9,000 years. 9,000 years of continuous, high-resolution environmental record from a single mountain region in the American Southwest. That chronology has been used to calibrate radiocarbon dating, making it one of the most practically important datasets in archaeology and geology. It has been used to reconstruct past climates, identify volcanic eruptions, and understand the relationship between solar activity and tree growth. It is an irreplaceable scientific resource, and it is 9,000 years long. 9,000 years is impressive, but it's a tiny fraction of time. Vascular plants have existed for approximately 400 million years, trees with woody stems for perhaps 360 million years. The bristlecone pine chronology covers approximately 9,000 of those years. What about the other 360 million years? What about the tree ring record of every forest that grew and was destroyed? That record existed. It was carried in the wood of every tree for 360 million years, and it is gone. Compressed into coal in some cases, decayed into soil in others, lost to geological processes that transform and destroy biological material. The record existed. The record is gone. What we know about the past without it is a small fraction. Every great forest accumulated a biological record of its time. Conditions of its atmosphere, temperatures, rainfall patterns, events that disturbed it. That record was stored in wood, in rings, in preserved organic material. When the forests ended, the record ended. We are trying to understand history from fragments that survived. Ice cores, sediment cores, pollen records, rare, scattered fossils. What would we know if the great forests had not ended? What if the Carboniferous forests had never collapsed? What if the trees of 300 million years ago were still standing? Still carrying the record of every year since they began? I do not know the answer to that question. I think nobody does. But the question is pointing at something important. Something about the relationship between forests and the knowledge they carry. Something about what we have lost that we do not know we have lost. Because the record of what we lost was in the forests, and the forests are gone. The stumps remain, in Humboldt County and in the coal seams. And the stumps are the only answer the forests left behind. A flat surface, pointing at the sky, saying, without any words at all, something was here, something enormous was here, and it is gone now. And the question of what it knew is still open.